November 27, 1978. A man bypasses the metal detectors at San Francisco City Hall by slipping through a basement window. He carries a loaded .38 caliber revolver and 10 extra rounds of ammunition in his pocket. Within minutes, the mayor and a prominent city supervisor will be dead, shot at point-blank range in their own offices. The shooter makes no attempt to flee, turning himself in to the authorities shortly after the echoes of gunfire fade. By all conventional legal standards, this is a textbook case of premeditated first-degree murder, carrying the very real threat of the gas chamber. Yet, the trial that follows will unravel into one of the most controversial legal battles in American history, birthing a defense strategy that sounds like a punchline, but successfully dismantled a capital murder charge. The defendant was Dan White, a former police officer, firefighter, and recently resigned city supervisor, who felt deeply betrayed by the political machine. His victims were Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey, two of the most powerful and progressive figures in San Francisco. White did not deny pulling the trigger. He offered a full, tearful confession to the police mere hours after the killings. For the prosecution, led by District Attorney Thomas Norman, the path to a first-degree murder conviction seemed completely unobstructed. They possessed the murder weapon, the audio-taped confession, and the clear physical evidence of calculated entry into the building. Before the first opening statement was even delivered, the defense initiated a masterclass in psychological profiling during voir dire, the preliminary examination process used to select a jury. Defense attorney Douglas Schmidt meticulously weeded out politically active citizens, specifically targeting those who might harbor strong sympathies for the progressive policies of the victims. The resulting jury was largely composed of working-class, conservative-leaning individuals who could implicitly relate to the defendant's background in civil service. This early procedural victory was critical, ensuring the audience for the upcoming psychological narrative was already primed for empathy rather than political outrage. Facing an insurmountable wall of physical evidence, Schmidt had to orchestrate a miraculous legal pivot. He could not argue the facts of the shooting, so he chose to litigate the architecture of the defendant's mind. Schmidt's strategy relied entirely on the concept of diminished capacity, a legal doctrine distinctly different from temporary insanity. While temporary insanity argues a defendant did not know right from wrong at the exact moment of the crime, diminished capacity asserts that a defendant's mental state was so severely compromised they could not form the specific intent required for first-degree murder. To save his client from execution, Schmidt had to prove that the assassinations were not the result of cold calculation, but the tragic explosion of a profoundly broken psyche. The courtroom rapidly transformed from a theater of forensic evidence into a deep psychological autopsy. Schmidt painted a portrait of a man drowning in overwhelming, untreated clinical depression. The defense argued that the immense pressure of political failure, financial ruin, and deep-seated feelings of personal inadequacy had entirely eroded the defendant's emotional regulation. This was not a calculated political assassination, the defense insisted, but a complete somatic breakdown. The meticulous planning, including the basement window entry and the extra bullets, was reframed not as malice aforethought, but as the robotic, irrational actions of a man operating in a fugue state of severe mental illness. The defense's strategy extended to the cross-examination of the very police officers who had arrested the defendant. Schmidt gently questioned his client's former colleagues on the stand, eliciting testimony that the man they booked that day seemed entirely detached from reality. The officers described a suspect who appeared hollowed out, staring blankly and responding with a bizarre, flat affect. This testimony from seasoned law enforcement veterans provided crucial, unbiased corroboration for the defense's theory of a total psychological break, coming from witnesses the prosecution had called to establish guilt. To substantiate this invisible mental collapse, the defense introduced a highly unconventional piece of circumstantial evidence: the defendant's diet. Witnesses testified that the previously health-conscious former athlete had abandoned his rigid discipline, retreating into isolation and consuming vast quantities of sugary junk food. This dietary shift was presented to the jury not as the cause of his murderous actions, but as a glaring physical symptom of his deepening depression. It was a tangible marker of a man who had entirely given up on himself and his life. Dr. Martin Blinder, a forensic psychiatrist, took the stand to connect these behavioral dots for the jury, According to Dr. Blinder's testimony, the massive intake of sugar exacerbated a pre-existing chemical imbalance in the defendant's brain. The psychiatrist explained that the junk food binges created wild fluctuations in blood sugar levels, worsening the severe depressive episodes and further impairing cognitive function. The sugar did not create the murderous intent, but it fueled the depressive spiral that shattered the defendant's ability to reason. The legal framework supporting this testimony was rooted in decades of California case law that had slowly expanded the definition of mental impairment. To secure an acquittal on the first-degree murder charges, the defense did not need to prove the defendant was legally insane. They only needed to inject a reasonable doubt regarding his capacity to premeditate and deliberate. By overwhelming the jury with psychiatric jargon and complex medical theories, Schmidt aimed to obscure the stark brutality of the crime scene and replace it with a clinical diagnosis. This specific psychiatric testimony would eventually be flattened by the media into the notorious Twinkie Defense, a label that completely misunderstood the actual legal maneuver. Deconstructing the strategy reveals that Schmidt never argued that a sugary pastry forced a man to kill. Instead, the defense masterfully used the junk food consumption as a tangible, relatable metric of mental deterioration. It was a brilliant, desperate gamble to give the jury a physical anchor for the abstract concept of diminished capacity, effectively muddying the prosecution's clear-cut narrative of political revenge. The prosecution, caught off guard by the sheer audacity of this psychological deep dive, fought to drag the narrative back to the concrete facts of the crime. Prosecutor Norman hammered away at the timeline, emphasizing the deliberate choice to pack extra ammunition and the conscious decision to avoid the building's security checkpoints. He argued fiercely that these actions required clear, sequential thinking and undeniable premeditation. Norman urged the jury to look at the physical evidence, not the psychiatric theories, insisting that a man who reloads his weapon between killings is acting with absolute lethal intent. Seeking to cement the image of a cold-blooded killer, the prosecution played the tape of the defendant's police confession in open court. It was intended to be the final nail in the coffin, showcasing a man admitting to the brutal killings of George Moscone and Harvey Milk. The prosecution believed the sheer reality of hearing the killer's voice would shatter the defense's carefully constructed illusion of mental incompetence. However, the introduction of this audio evidence backfired in a spectacular and unanticipated way. As the recording echoed through the hushed courtroom, the jury did not hear a callous, calculating assassin. Instead, they heard a man weeping uncontrollably, his voice cracking with anguish as he detailed his perceived failures and intense emotional pain. The defense watched as several jurors openly wiped tears from their own eyes. The prosecution's star piece of evidence had inadvertently humanized the defendant, perfectly corroborating the defense's portrait of a man suffering from severe psychological collapse. The defense immediately seized upon this emotional shift, treating the confession tape not as an admission of guilt, but as exculpatory evidence of a broken mind. Exculpatory evidence is material that tends to excuse, justify, or absolve the fault or guilt of a defendant. By reframing the confession, Schmidt argued that the raw, unfiltered emotion on the tape proved his client lacked the cold, calculating mindset required for first-degree murder. The tape became the ultimate proof of diminished capacity, turning the prosecution's strongest weapon against them. The legal battleground now centered entirely on the definition of malice aforethought, a crucial legal term requiring a defendant to act with a conscious disregard for human life. In California law at the time, if diminished capacity successfully negated malice aforethought, the charge of murder had to be reduced to manslaughter. The jury faced a monumental task, forced to weigh the brutal reality of two dead public servants against complex psychiatric theories and a deeply emotional, tear-soaked confession tape. During closing arguments, Schmidt leaned heavily into the emotional resonance of that audio recording, urging the jury to look past the political titles of the victims and see the profound human tragedy of a mind destroyed by depression. He argued that the prosecution had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that his client was capable of forming the intent to murder. Norman countered with a plea for common sense, warning the jury that accepting this psychiatric defense would create a dangerous precedent where any stressful life event could excuse a calculated double homicide. The judge issued extensive instructions to the jury, meticulously detailing the legal thresholds for first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and voluntary manslaughter. The instructions explicitly required the jury to consider the psychiatric testimony regarding the defendant's capacity to harbor malice. The fate of the trial now hinged on whether 12 ordinary citizens believed that severe depression could effectively erase criminal intent, or if the physical acts of loading a gun and pulling a trigger superseded any psychological diagnosis. After nearly 6 days of grueling deliberation, the jury returned to a courtroom suffocating with tension. The foreperson read the verdicts aloud, sending shockwaves through the room and eventually the entire nation. Dan White was found guilty not of first-degree murder, but of 2 counts of voluntary manslaughter. The jury had fully accepted the diminished capacity argument, concluding that the defendant lacked the necessary mental state for murder, effectively validating the defense's controversial strategy. The immediate consequence of this verdict was a profound eruption of public outrage. The maximum sentence for voluntary manslaughter at the time was roughly 7 years, meaning the defendant would likely serve only a fraction of that time for a double assassination. This outcome completely changed a city's perception of justice, igniting the violent White Night riots as thousands of citizens stormed City Hall. Police cars were set ablaze, and the streets of San Francisco descended into chaos, fueled by the fury of a community that believed the legal system had fundamentally failed them. The legacy of this trial extended far beyond the shattered glass of San Francisco's Civic Center. The sheer public disbelief over the verdict forced a massive legislative reckoning. Within a few years, California voters decisively passed Proposition 8, effectively abolishing the diminished capacity defense in the state's criminal courts. The strategy that saved a man from the gas chamber became a cautionary tale, forever altering how the American legal system evaluates the delicate intersection of mental illness, personal responsibility, and the ultimate, often flawed, pursuit of justice.